Well, greetings and welcome to Faith Connections. I'm very grateful that you've joined us for a brand new series. Faith Connections is all about connecting our faith to everyday life. Today, in this new series, we take a look at deep thirst, not a thirst for water, but a deep thirst for God. This new series comes from the Old Testament, and it's entitled From Tragedy to Victory. Our prayer is that during this series, we will discover renewal, especially during these challenging days. And it's in this study that we will discover how God responds to a heart that desperately longs to know him. Dr. David Sharp gave us some insight or some advice, words of wisdom, you might say, as we read the Psalms, words to think about. And the first word would be that of presence, God's presence. Not only does God speak to us and give revelation to us, but God also listens to us. He hears our cries. You might say that the Psalms give words for us to speak back to God. A long time ago, somebody taught me to pray the Psalms. They are powerful, personal words that communicate with a God who dearly loves us. And then there is the word safety. Throughout the Psalms, we will discover that God's face is always turned in our direction. Through embarrassment, shame, guilt, we see that God gives us an attentive ear. He's like the welcoming father who awaits the arrival of his son with wide open arms, offering forgiveness and showing mercy. And then there's the word of deliverance. In a world of brokenness, we hear the word deliverance. And we know that God is a God who delivers and rescues his people. Our passage of scripture for this study today is Psalm 63, verses 1 through 11, and it begins with an introduction. Well, it tells us that this is a Psalm of David when he was in the desert of Judah. So Psalm 63 identifies David and gives us the location in the desert of Judah. So this could have taken place. This psalm could have been written when David was fleeing from Saul, who was attempting to kill him. That story is told in 1 Samuel chapter 24 through verses 26. But since David refers to himself as a king in verse 11, it's more likely that this psalm is written when his son Absalom is revolting and seeking to take over the kingdom, and so David has to flee. 2 Samuel chapter 15 through 18 describe Absalom's plot to take over the kingdom. There's no doubt that David is devastated by the betrayal of his son and the fickleness of his people. So we discover that possibly David composes this psalm while he's determining what his next steps in life might be. So we can sense in this psalm, as we read those words in just a moment, that David felt the weight of disappointment and hurt that this world so often puts upon us. We've experienced some of those emotions during the pandemic of 2020. We've witnessed that in Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We personally have some very dear friends or who have loved ones in the Ukraine, and we have heard heart-wrenching stories of what the people of the Ukraine are enduring, pain that we cannot even begin to imagine. They are walking through a wilderness. So if you find yourself walking through a wilderness today, I believe that this psalm will speak to you. So if you will, go with me to Psalm 63, verses 1 through 11, and let's hear these very personal words of David. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory, because your love is better than life. My lips will glorify you. I will praise you as long as I live. And in your name, I will lift up my hands. I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. On my bed, I remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night, because you are my help. I sing in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your right hand upholds me. Those who want to kill me will be destroyed. You will go down. They will go down to the depths of the earth. They will be given over to the sword and become food for jackals. But the king will rejoice in God. All who swear by God will glory in him, while the mouths of liars will be silenced. Well, King David begins this psalm with a personal note. Look at how he speaks with God, how he refers to God. You, God, are my God, and earnestly I seek you. It reveals to us that the God we serve, he's personal. Oh yeah, he's powerful and awesome, but he's personal. He can be known. He seeks an intimate relationship with us. So too often, maybe we identify with David's feelings of being abandoned. And in such moments, in those moments, like David, we become acutely aware of our desperate need or a longing for God. There are a lot of things in this world that promise fulfillment, promise abundance, but truly leave us empty. There is nothing in this world that can fill the spiritual vacuum deep within us. That's a void that only God can fill. Now, we don't always recognize where our hearts feel empty or what we are actually seeking. Maybe we think that what we're looking for is a source of happiness, or to be happy, or to be secure, or maybe something else. But the truth is, our deepest longing is actually God. We were just created that way. And until we reach that place in this journey, we find ourselves feeling empty. So what we see in this passage is that David describes his heart's desire for God as a desperate thirst, almost to the point that he faints. Well, I've heard stories about people who suffered from dehydration to the point that it caused them to pass out. David feels that way. It's the kind of thirst one experiences in a dry and parched land where there is no water. Well, a Judean desert would reflect those kinds of feelings. David realizes that he needs God, and he recognizes just how much he needed God. The God he described as my God. I know this may sound strange, but there are some values in life's desert. It's there that we are reminded of how desperately we really do need God. When we walk through the hard times of life, it can be a moment of an awakening. It awakens within us a deep longing for the Lord, and it moves us in that direction. If we get to verse 2, really verses 2 through 8, David begins to talk about his longing heart, and how it found satisfaction in God. I love these words. It's so appropriate at where we are in our current state. I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory. So there is something about being together with God's people in his sanctuary. Folks, we've had stretches where that's not been a possibility. And the reality is, now that it is a possibility, there are still some folks who are missing, and some health concerns prohibit that. But maybe some just have allowed other things to fill the void in their life. Folks, there is something significantly powerful about being together with God's people. We need that. We need each other. Even in the midst of significant loss, David declares that his heart can sing because he is connected with the one whose love is better than life to him. It's that relationship that made a difference in his life. It's like God's love is food for his soul. God's love made his hungry heart feel like a well-fed stomach. When David spoke of God's love, he's not just talking about a warm, fuzzy feeling, but he's talking about this magnificent love called Hesed love, love that is not based on performance or right response, but a love that loves us. I know hard to understand and it need to get in the right context, loves us no matter what. It is like the constant love of a parent for their child, but at a more intense and steadfast level. This is the kind of love that fills the vacuum of the human heart. Only that kind of love that comes from God can give rest to the restless heart. It is someone who loves us, warts and all. We need someone who will keep loving us in the middle of our messiness. It's a love that is unconditional. But I want you to keep in mind that God loves us just like we are, but he loves us far too much to leave us like we are. This little phrase caught my attention, that it just says this: under the shadow of such love, David could sing praises, even as he lay awake through the watches of the night, contemplating his circumstances. Questions, unanswered questions about the future. That would describe David. He was unsure of what the future would hold. I think he reflected on some failures back in his life as a father and even as a leader. Satan has a way of showing up deep into the night. And he can attempt to rob God's people of confidence and joy with constant reminders of our circumstances and inadequacies and uncertainties. Yet we ought to be like David. David grasped hold of God's unfailing love, and he would cling to the strength and courage that he would get from it. In return, God's powerful, life-giving, and loving right hand would lift him up. I love that picture that in the midst of life's most difficult circumstances, God reaches out his hand of love and mercy and lifts us up with his righteous right hand. That's what keeps us steady in difficult hours. God's unrelenting love becomes an anchor for a soul that is troubled. It holds us fast while the world whirls around us. And it even might enable us to sing praises in the midst of the darkest nights, like it did for David. Are you in a wilderness today? Are you facing uncertainties? Are you enduring circumstances? Remember, David's likely been betrayed by his son. We know Absalom seeks to overtake the kingdom. Can you imagine what that must have been like for a father? So as this psalm draws to a close, David tells us that his longing heart eventually becomes a victorious heart. And in light of God's love, and the light of God's love generated glimpses of hope for his thirsty soul. David came to see the time when God would take care of his enemies. They would go down and their mouths would be silenced. David could envision a day when he would rejoice in God along with others who had honored the Lord. David knew that God would have the last word, even in the midst of his difficulty. To David, the defeat of his enemies was only further confirmation of God's steadfast love. David knew that God would not allow the wicked to prevail, that God would have his hand watching over him. He understood that Absalom's revolt was not just some power political move, but that it threatened God's ultimate purpose for his people. But David knew that the Lord would protect his people, his plans, because he loved them. Hey, folks, life can become like a desert some days. There are disappointments and loss and betrayal, and any number of other adversities that might come our way. It's in that environment that we may well discover the deepest craving of our soul is really for God. Sometimes we just need a desert to remind us that our greatest need is God. That the thirsty soul who seeks him will find him. Hey, as we prepare to close the day, just a straightforward, honest question. In what ways do you need God? Are you really hungry and thirsty for him? We close with those opening words of our psalm today that just stirred my own heart, that spoke to me, and maybe they will to you. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. Do I really earnestly seek him? I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. Hey, if you're in the wilderness today, it's a reminder that we need God.